You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show.
You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi. We bring you news from the local area around the world, interviews from the world's best athletes, sports people who work in sport across a wide range of disciplines, coaching, training, psychology, nutrition, top athletes, world-class sports people. The aim is to increase participation and awareness in sport, and we also have a segment where we speak to some of the world's most influential people in the field of psychology, talk about mental health and their perspective and their perceptions on psychology and related fields. Today we have a really interesting guest who's going to speak about rugby as well as performance nutrition. We're in line for a very fascinating interview. I'm sure you really enjoy it and hopefully get an insight into what it's like to play rugby at the highest level, and also the influence of nutrition in sport as well. So Lauren Delany is a performance nutritionist. She's a rugby player for Sale Sharks Irish Rugby and is studying a PhD in rugby nutrition. So welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Cheers. Thanks for having me, Jimmy. I'm really happy to be here.
Now, really interesting background you have. You sort of play rugby and nutrition. It'd be interesting to sort of see your take on all things rugby and nutrition. But I suppose if we start from the beginning, how did you get into rugby yourself? I mean, what sort of inspired you to go into rugby?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, which I get asked quite a lot. So I actually haven't been playing rugby for very long, probably. I think I'm heading into my 6th or 7th year. Mm-hmm. So I actually played basketball for 15 years and played internationally underage as well. And essentially I moved over to England to do my master's in sports nutrition. I completed that. I continued to play basketball, and I moved to Milton Keynes, and there was nowhere to play basketball. Mm-hmm. So one of myself and one of my friends from work, essentially, we decided we wanted to make friends in a new area and gave rugby a go. So I suppose my family have always kind of been rugby fans, so they're diehard Leinster supporters back home in Ireland. So basketball or rugby was always around, and I always knew about it, and I don't remember knowing very much about rugby or women's rugby back in Ireland, but it was definitely, there was a bigger awareness of it in England when I moved across. And essentially around that time, I knew of a lot of international basketball players who very recently converted over to playing rugby and had done really well and were playing internationally for Ireland. So I almost thought, look, if they can do it, why not give it a go? And kind of the rest is history. No,
absolutely, and that's really fascinating and inspiring too, to sort of to move from one sport. What was the transition like? I mean, obviously basketball, it's an explosive sport as well. The movement, the physiology, hand-eye coordination, and agility. How did you find making the transition from basketball to rugby?
Yeah, it was actually surprisingly easier than I thought it would be. Yeah. And there's the real obvious things of going from a lovely indoor sport where weather's not an issue to an outdoor sport played in winter. So that was kind of a big thing that I had to get used to and get a lot of waterproof clothes and stuff like that. But in terms of the physical side, from a ball handling perspective, hand-eye coordination, catching high balls, in the back three. A lot of that came relatively easy to me. And there's other aspects that were really transferable in terms of the fitness side of it, the speed and sprint and agility side, which again transferred really, really well into the rugby. The biggest obvious one was contact. And tackling and rucks and stuff. So I suppose I was known in basketball to be a lot more of a physical player. Quite often would be known for getting quite a few fouls. So I wasn't kind of afraid of that at all. And I suppose when I joined my first rugby team, Bletchley Ladies, down in Milton Keynes, they were great. They regularly had new players joining, and they took the time to take the new girls out of the group and teach us the basics of how to tackle, how to be tackled, how to enter a ruck and those basics, which kind of was really great to be able to learn those at a slow speed with a lot of other new girls. And I think I picked that up relatively quickly as well. But there's just some basic things that I suppose 15 years of playing rugby and sitting on your heels and sidestepping, that's a kind of a difficult one to overcome in terms of when you're entering that tackle zone. So there's always things to improve on. But I'd say a relatively smooth-ish transition, if you can call it that.
No, that's really good. I mean, it's really fascinating how you did that. I mean, we sort of see sometimes, rugby league and rugby union players sort of transitioning, and it's I suppose it's like you've mentioned there, there's various sort of challenges. And what about the rules in for you, Lauren? How did you sort of find the rules when you went to rugby? Did that take time to learn as well? Did you have the gist of the game already?
No, the rules were definitely one that was probably the slowest to adapt to. It really made me realise early on, when you're kind of watching on the TV, when you're watching rugby and you're listening to the commentary and the referees, you don't really know half of the rules in terms of when you're playing. So I mean, there was loads of people always messed with me because I actually had to Google when I first started, how do we call all the positions? Because I knew all the backs, but I didn't know any of the forwards. But that was pretty common, when you first start out. But to be honest, I'm still learning some of the rules today, and obviously every year, World Rugby, or a few years, they bring in new rules and trying to get an understanding of how they work and how they might impact me as a player or us as a team. It's kind of a constantly evolving, and I always learn new rules or new ways that kind of the referees interpret rules. But that probably took the longest, and like I said, I'm still learning to this day all the rules around it.
And in terms of Ireland, Irish rugby, I mean, many of our listeners will be familiar with the men's rugby team. Many of the listeners may be familiar with the women's rugby as well. But just to sort of increase the profile, we know that the men's Irish rugby team is a formidable team. They're always very, very competitive and sort of I suppose you could say in one sense they sort of punch above their weight comparatively to some of the nations with huge playing pools to choose from. I mean, Ireland's always been a strong nation traditionally in rugby. Where does the women's rugby team, whereabouts would they be on the international stage, Lauren?
It's a good question. I suppose if we kind of look at where we're at the minute, so right now we've got World Cup qualifiers coming up at the end of the year, so we're within a pool of similar nations to try and qualify, and that's because we came, I think it was 8th or 9th in the last World Cup, which was the one spot outside of the automatic qualification. So I suppose that's where we're at in terms of the World Cup. In terms of Six Nations, we had a really successful recent Six Nations, coming third in the Six Nations at the start of the year, behind France and England, who are real powerhouses in the women's game. So England, France and New Zealand are the only three teams in the world that are professional or close to professional. So unfortunately Ireland and the likes of Wales, Scotland, Italy, we're not professional, so we're amateur players. So we've all got full-time jobs, and we all train evenings and weekends and do the day job as well, which obviously, there is a big divide there, and it is obviously a big challenge to be able to take that step up to the next level and compete with full-time professional athletes. But like I said, we've been doing really well. We've kind of taken a step up in every Six Nations for the last 3 or 4 years, and looking to qualify for the World Cup that's coming up the back end of 2022.
No, that's brilliant. And in terms of, I'm just sort of I was just sort of reflecting on the sevens rugby as well. Lauren, is that something that you ever considered doing, or obviously it's a different game? I'm just sort of thinking the Olympics really in terms of the sevens. Did you ever sort of think of maybe going into that area, or obviously you sort of 100% committed to what you're doing in rugby, or has that ever been a thought for you?
Yeah, I've definitely considered it. I mean, I haven't been playing, as I mentioned, rugby very long in the past, and sevens kind of in most countries is full-time professional. So our Irish team based in Dublin, they're all full-time professional athletes. So, and I suppose I probably come into the game a lot older, with only starting playing at 25, where we've got quite a good pathway in Ireland with quite a lot of young girls, 16, 17, 18-year-olds coming through the pathways and becoming full-time athletes, essentially. So it's probably not an option for me now. I've probably joined the sport a bit too late, and would probably have to be in Ireland and make big kind of life changes if that was an option. But yeah, I play a little bit of, I used to play a little bit of sevens rugby during the summer in terms of socially and all the tournaments that are around England. But I suppose for now, I'm 100% committed to 15s at the minute and getting to that World Cup next year.
Absolutely. And in terms of your challenges, sort of, what are some of the challenges that you've faced since you started playing rugby? Obviously, you've sort of managed to now play at the highest level. Sort of the journey itself, what would you say have been your challenges getting to where you are, Lauren?
I suppose for me, the biggest challenge has always been managing kind of my day job, managing the training and the travel that I've got to do for Ireland. So we go through blocks and we train at weekends in camps from Friday to Sunday. So anytime there's a block of training, for example, for the next 2 months, it's every single weekend I'm back in Ireland, which obviously brings massive challenges in terms of logistics and not really having a social life and trying to manage doing a full-time PhD as well as being a performance nutritionist and some consultancy. So as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of just day-to-day organisational challenges and a lot of people to keep up to date with and organise my life. That's probably always been the biggest challenge. And I suppose working in elite rugby as a nutritionist, I recognise that, it's not always... for example, during the season, it's not normally okay to take kind of annual leave when you're working. But obviously that's a big challenge when you're playing rugby yourself. But any kind of team or any company that I've worked for have always been really supportive of my international goals as well. I suppose the other really obvious challenge has always been just kind of the highs and the lows of sport.
Absolutely,
which kind of everyone experiences. I think in those, obviously the first year of playing for Ireland was an unbelievable experience, but in terms of results, we only won one game out of our Six Nations, and we didn't put out a great performance, and it was very much a developmental side in those a few years ago. So that was really challenging then to join an international team and be on an absolute high, and then not get the performances that you want or that you're working for. And probably similar in terms of my recent being signed for Sale Sharks last year, the first team that we've put out in the Allianz Premiership. Unbelievable start and great to be part of the team and an amazing kind of journey that we're on. But again, not getting a lot of the results that we wanted to and finishing 9th out of 10th in the table. Again, it's balancing the highs of being on the journey and all the positives that come with it, with probably the lows and the losses and maybe not putting in the performances that we really wanted to.
Yeah, and as you sort of, I mean, I was going to ask you about the highlights of your sort of career thus far. You've mentioned some of the highlights for you. Are there sort of any sort of key highlights for you that you've experienced, Lauren? Obviously, playing at international levels is a huge thing. I can imagine that'd be a big highlight for you. But is there what are the main highlights for you thus far when you reflect back? I know you got many years left to go as well, but just thus far, would you say your biggest highlights have been?
Yeah, my first biggest highlight would have to have been that first cap for Ireland. my first start as well. So I played 15 against the USA in an autumn international in Dublin in 2018. And yeah, that was that has to be one of the biggest highlights of the career so far. Another highlight was probably one situation, but for two different reasons. The second game I played in and started for Ireland was against England in that autumn international series, and it was actually at Twickenham in front of 10,000 people, so that was a pretty unbelievable experience, and I scored my first try for Ireland there as well, so that was definitely a big highlight of the game, and we put in a really excellent performance against England as well. And then I'd have to throw in there the first game and the first try with Sale Sharks last season. It was amazing to play as part of the club, and such a successful club with a lot of history and a powerhouse in the Northwest. It's amazing to be part of that journey from the very beginning, from their very first women's team, and to score kind of the first try of the season in the first game was a pretty great experience, and definitely a highlight so far.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And in terms of yourself, the performance nutrition side of things, has that sort of helped you in your career? I mean, our listeners are, I'm sure, wondering, performance nutrition, how does that work? And I mean, in the last few weeks in the UK, it's obviously been really, really hot in terms of, making sure, players are hydrated when they're playing sports or training or pre-season, for example. But what does it extend to, Lauren, being a performance nutrition? What are some of the, and has it benefited you in your career in rugby?
Yeah, I think it's definitely benefited me in my career. I suppose I've only recently gone on this journey with this PhD and with Leeds Rhinos, but for the previous 7 years I was working with the English Institute of Sport, primarily British cycling, with the Olympics and the Paralympic athletes of Team GB. So I suppose for me, being within that elite world-class environment day in, day out, and brushing shoulders and helping and supporting, world-class Olympic and Paralympic champions, definitely always focused me on what I wanted to achieve in my own sporting career. It's given me loads of drive and determination, and comparing myself to some of the athletes, the female athletes in the gym, and what they lift, and can I push myself more, and what dedication and what focus do they, and what commitments and sacrifices they've got to make, and am I able to do that? Am I able to commit to that as well? So it's definitely helped me in terms of being part of that environment. In terms of the nutrition side of it, that's probably an obvious one as well. And it's always a question I get asked, am I pretty on it with my nutrition, or is it something that, do as I say or not what I do? I'd be pretty proud in saying that I'm very good with my nutrition. I've got a really good balance. I eat well the majority of the time, but have a treat whenever I want to as well. And I suppose I've got a lot of that quite good knowledge in my own head, that I don't need to be too diligent, but I know kind of the day-to-day what works for me and how my body responds. In terms of what kind of performance nutrition looks like from a day-to-day perspective, in terms of the English Institute of Sport, we always focused on almost a 3-point approach. So anything we'd advise athletes would be focused on one of 3 points, either trying to support athletes to improve training adaptations, to reduce the risk of illness or injury, or enhance kind of your competition or your game day performance. So one of those 3 areas, and that can look anything from individual support and focusing on the behaviour change side of things, like one-to-one with athletes, team-based strategies, for example, with my work with Leeds Rhinos and how the team works and functions, and how food and nutrition plays a role within that, and then influencing things like the logistics and the environment, and how can we support athletes as best as possible to make the best decisions that they can in terms of their food, their nutrition, their hydration, maybe without even them knowing or thinking about it. But they're kind of the main kind of focuses and main ways we support athletes in performance nutrition.
That's really interesting, because in sport we sort of, we talk about the physical training, the mental training, and how important they are, and I suppose nutrition in one sense is obviously, well, it is crucial too. And is it possible to quantify how much of an impact nutrition has? I mean, my guess is there's obviously articles in the literature and so on and so forth. But do you have a way, or obviously that I'm sure it's in strict confidence, but is there a way that you can sort of measure how much of an impact nutrition is having, Lauren?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's probably one of the most challenging ones for us as nutritionists. Proving that impact. I think every sport is very different in terms of how we can prove that impact. You take, for example, a weight category sport. Well, that's really obvious in terms of, the athlete can't compete unless they make weight. So the nutritionist has a really important role in even helping the athlete get to the floor to even compete. Where on the other side, you've got, for example, some cyclists where there's a massive performance benefit of being a certain weight, or which influences kind of power to mass of going up hills or sprinting and being as fast as possible, to then the other side of it, and probably the more challenging sports to work with, are the likes of your team sports and your technical and tactical sports, where there are a ton of different factors that can influence a win or a loss or scoring a try in rugby, for example. But if you kind of look a little bit broader at the focus of performance nutrition, we talked in the English Institute of Sport a lot about unleashing the power of food. And if you talk in Olympic or Paralympic cycles, if you think about, I know the recent cycle was over 5 years because it was delayed, but if you look at a 4-year cycle, we calculated that on average an athlete will eat about 10,000 or 8,000 meals in that period of time. And essentially that's 8,000 opportunities that you could have a positive or negative impact on your physiology, that you could potentially fuel better for a training session, you could recover better, or you could get more out of each training session and better adaptation. And if you look at in comparison to training, you couldn't say that about training. You don't have that many opportunities. If you break that down another level, some research shows that on average we make about 200 decisions a day on what to eat and what we should drink. So again, there's many opportunities every single day that we could have a real positive impact on our training adaptations, our risk of illness, our risk of injury, and potentially our performance on the day. So in terms of quantifying it with numbers, it can be very challenging unless you're in those maybe weight category or linear energetic sports. But in terms of looking a lot broader, in terms of the other areas that it has an impact, I mean, again, I'm biased, but I think it's one of the probably one of the most important elements of kind of the sports science and support systems.
No, I can imagine so, and it's quite interesting you say, and I suppose without sort of generalising, I speak maybe anecdotally, but it seems that at least in football, for example, it's taken a while for nutrition, and as I said, without sort of generalising, I'm sure each club is different and each player is different, but generally speaking, it's taken a little bit longer to sort of to have an impact in football compared to maybe Europe, and we sort of saw, and I read about a player who'd moved to Italy from the UK, and how he changed, or at least my understanding, I don't know the player, I don't know what the implications were, but it sort of talked about how the nutrition had changed and how it did transform his game, obviously without knowing him or what went on, but it does go to show how it can make a huge difference really in terms of knowing the right things to eat. But I suppose the question I'm sort of getting at is it an individualized thing, do you think, Lauren, or are certain things I suppose general, but from a nutrition point of view, is it something that you sort of speak to nutritionists and individualize it for yourself, or how does that generally work?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I mean, I think it's really important to remember that sports nutrition in particular, or performance nutrition, is still a very, very young discipline. It's only really been around in the research around 20 to 30 years. So we're still on this upward momentum of gaining knowledge and gaining research and trying to figure out what the best strategies are in terms of performance. And I think we're starting to come to a point now where we've had quite a lot of athletes who have been supported by nutritionists consistently for kind of 5-10 years or so within the systems. And quite commonly at the minute, I'd either hear of coaches telling me or players or other support staff saying that the athlete knows what they need to do, but they just don't do it. And I think that represents a real change and an evolution in performance nutrition, and moving away from the basics of right, we just need to know exactly what we need to do, moving towards the side of right, how can we help improve someone's behaviour or change their behaviour? And I think that's the next evolution in performance nutrition. And I think that kind of second question really touched on it. I mean, some of the guidelines and some of the nutrition support or maybe research that's out there is quite general, and there is some elements, for example, your target of protein intake around 1.8 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight per day, you could probably broadly cover most sports and most athletes within that population. However, you need that practitioner and that nutritionist to individualize what that looks like. Is it possible? Will that compromise other nutrition or nutrients in their diet? How is that physically going to look like throughout the day? You know, how do you factor in the athlete's preferences and their likes and their dislikes? How is it going to work around training and their lives and their logistics and their jobs? And I think that individualization and impact on the athlete's behaviours, where the nutritionist is absolutely crucial, and a qualified nutritionist at that as well, is really important to interpret the research, interpret the guidelines and the recommendations, and then make it as specific as possible to the individual so that it's achievable. Because unfortunately, in a lot of areas at the minute, we assume now that knowledge equals behaviour change, which it doesn't, and there's enough research out there to show that we need to take account of a lot of other factors, our peers, the environment, our different forms of motivation, our emotional regulation, which all have a massive impact on making potentially the right nutrition decision for your performance.
No, absolutely. That's really interesting, fascinating, Lauren. I think what you mentioned before was quite interesting too. Really fascinating in terms of the approach itself, and I mean, I suppose in one sense, as we sort of progress in sport and sort of move forward, and the margins are finer and finer. I mean, you still get, I suppose, like for example in football, you still get the occasional person saying, well, back in my day we did this, that and the other, and but the more we see people playing for longer, the more we sort of see people, in form for longer, and then talk about what they eat as well. And I was reading an article. I can only go off what I read. What you read sometimes. Like for example, Ronaldo. I can't remember where I was reading it, but he talked about his nutrition plan, and obviously I'm sure there's many other factors, and for him, playing for as long as he has at that level. But it does start to make you think, well, it is a huge variable. Do you think, in your experience, I mean, obviously you've worked in different sports, but do you think as people are sort of beginning to take more and more note, looking at, top performers, when they sort of speak about how nutrition has been key for them, think, what, if it's good enough for them, then it's definitely something we've got to take, really, really seriously?
Yeah, I think nutrition is one of those disciplines where it's really accessible to everyone, because everyone eats, everyone understands, the concepts that we're talking about in terms of eating more or less, or more fluid, or having higher fibre foods, or more fruits and vegetables. It's accessible to everyone, and I think that comes with both positives and negatives, or real challenges to the discipline. So positives, the obvious ones, it's accessible, it's easily translatable in terms of food and fluid. And for example, any kind of athlete out there can talk about their what their diet is, for example, or something that they've changed, or what's worked for them, and people can relate and understand it. The other side of that is there's massive challenges with it. Everyone has an opinion, and everyone, is
and
maybe
right.
not as
Exactly.
everyone's maybe not as qualified to give that advice, and that's why I emphasised earlier the importance, if you are going to get support from a nutritionist or a dietitian, that they're kind of registered and qualified, so that it's evidence informed and research supported advice that's given. I think it comes back to our point earlier around that individualization. Everyone's completely different. Everyone's gut is completely different, and everyone's preferences in terms of likes and dislikes and all their physiology is very different. So to say that one thing works for one person and it doesn't, we can't assume that then it will work for everyone else. For every gluten-free athlete, or for every one gluten-free Djokovic there's probably 1,000 other gluten-free tennis players who haven't made it to the level that he's at. So again, it's really interesting, and it grows the profile of food and nutrition. But it's just really important that it's done in kind of in a safe way, and that if anyone is looking out there to kind of change an element of their nutrition or what they're eating, that they kind of get qualified support in that way from a qualified nutritionist or a dietitian, and that they kind of bring a real sensible and kind of curious approach to it. So if there's anyone that's suddenly advising to remove an entire food group, or to create this divide between good or bad foods, at the end of the day, no food is good or bad. No food will kill you. You've just got to be really sensible, and there's got to be a really clever balance with it. So bringing a curious mind to anything that you're considering trying, and if it seems too extreme or if it seems too good to be true, then it probably is.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lauren. I think that's the other thing as well. Now we've the power of the internet and all these sort of things. Really, people look at things, and obviously these athletes have got people monitoring them, and they've got like he says, there's people who are qualified. You'd like to think anyway, and who are monitoring what they do, and for the general sort of layperson looking at that, it might not be the right thing to do, and there's many variables, the genetic, how we respond to things as well too. And I suppose in saying that, that's the other side to things too. With the internet being a useful resource, I suppose on the other side of things, you've got the according to TikTok brigade type thing, a bit of information. So there is that danger as well. I would think that people sort of a little bit of information, is there anything people, do you think, I know it's probably outside the scope of the conversation, but in terms of people looking to get nutrition, is there any sort of thing they should look at if they're going to maybe hire someone to help them with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose in terms of general nutrition principles or health focus, definitely having a qualified dietitian is really important. And with that, you can look at the British Dietetics Association website, which is where we register as dietitians. And I think that's a real clear distinction, because the word dietitian is actually a protected term, just like a doctor or a nurse or a speech and language therapist were registered with the HCPC, or the Healthcare and Professions Council. And so you're kind of guaranteed to get a qualified practitioner there. Now, on the other side of it, in terms of performance and sports nutrition, there is another registration which goes through the British Dietetic Association, and it's called the SENR, or the Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register. So again, if there's anyone out there that is looking to get some performance or sport nutrition advice, I definitely encourage them to go through that registration. And again, that's all online, and you can find a practitioner around the country there. But again, they're really important, because unfortunately, nutritionist is not a protected term, and anyone can call themselves a nutritionist with or without a qualification. So again, you've just got to be really cautious with who's giving you advice and what their qualifications are, and making sure you're getting the best, most qualified practitioner and support that you can do.
Absolutely, I think that's really an important thing, really, for sure. And obviously, you spend years learning and sort of researching, and that's a really important point for sure. And in terms of yourself, going forward, your vision, I mean, I'm sure that you sort of, certain things you sort of keep close to your chest, but where do you sort of see yourself? Where do you go from here, Lauren? You've achieved a lot in rugby. You've got the World Cup, no doubt. that you're aiming for, but in just generally at the PhD as well, what's your sort of vision going forward yourself?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
I suppose it probably depends on what hat I'm wearing day to day. I mean, for me, I'm just always kind of striving for that personal development. So whether it's kind of as a rugby player, as a nutritionist, a researcher in education, or whether it's kind of as a better friend, I think that's always my focus. And with that, I suppose it's in enjoying the journey to getting there as well. So I completely recognise, for example, my rugby career it won't be endless. I probably have a limited number of years. So enjoying the journey over the next few years, hopefully to qualify for the World Cup, to go there and to play the best I can. I think that's kind of the biggest focus, to kind of have no regrets and take every opportunity I can. I'm also really keen to kind of help Sale Sharks to become, on the women's side, a complete powerhouse in the Northwest in terms of rugby, and support the development of women's rugby around this region, which I think is kind of rife for opportunity and some amazing players coming out of the region. And then, I suppose from kind of a Leeds Rhinos and a PhD perspective, I'm just really, I've loved my first year of being a PhD student and kind of researching with Leeds Rhinos Rugby League and learning everything to do with Rugby League. I'm just really excited to see where my research goes and hopefully kind of complete my PhD in the next 3 years and contribute back to the research some real practical and valuable research to the field of nutrition.
No, that's brilliant. That's really interesting, and we'll certainly watch this space and look out for Ireland in the World Cup. Hopefully it all goes to sort of plan for you guys. And it's been a really fascinating interview, Lauren. I really found it interesting. No doubt the listeners have really found what you spoke about fascinating. Really, it's quite diverse and really interesting to hear about your career and the nutrition side of things too. So I really want to thank you for coming on board the show. It's been great speaking to you. That was Lauren Delany, performance nutritionist and rugby player for Sale Sharks and Irish Rugby, showing some insight into her career thus far, and also discussing nutrition and its impact in sports and in general. Who was kind enough to join us on the Friday Sports Show, Salford City Radio 94.5 FM, with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi.